All right, let's dive into some of the health and safety stuff for Paris. You sent over a really great guide, and, well, there's a lot in there. So we're going to pull out like the need to know things so you can really feel confident and ready for your trip. I mean, Paris is known for being pretty safe, and they have a really strong healthcare system, right? But especially as someone not from the EU, a little extra prep never hurts.
I couldn't agree more. Being proactive about the health and safety stuff just means you can relax and enjoy all those incredible things Paris has to offer, without that nagging worry in the back of your mind.
Totally. So let's jump right in. Okay, hospitals. I saw in the guide they mentioned this one. Hôpital Pitié-Salpêtrière. And it's like one of the biggest hospitals in all of Europe. That's kind of wild. But like, is bigger always better? Would that be the place to go for any kind of serious medical issue?
Oh, for sure. It's considered top-notch, especially for things like neurology and cardiology. But here's the thing about healthcare in France. It's got this kind of two-tiered structure. So you've got the public hospitals, like the one you mentioned, which are excellent, don't get me wrong, and they're generally more affordable, especially if you're an EU citizen. But then you've also got private clinics, which a lot of people choose because they often have faster service. But of course, that usually comes with a higher price tag.
Okay, so thinking about that two-tiered system, as a non-EU traveler, does that even apply to me? Like, would I have access to those public hospitals, or am I mainly looking at the private clinics?
That is a great question. And technically, yes, you can go to a public hospital, but the cost, it can be a lot higher if you don't have the right kind of insurance. So for a smoother experience and to avoid a potential financial hit, a private clinic might be the better choice. And actually, your guide mentions a specific one, Hôpital Américain. It's a private hospital with a lot of English-speaking staff, which can be a real plus for, someone visiting from outside France.
That's super helpful. Fingers crossed. I won't need to visit any hospitals, but it's definitely good to have that info. Now, the guide really stresses the importance of travel insurance, and I'll admit, it can be tempting to skip, especially if you're trying to keep costs down. But it sounds like, for non-EU folks especially, it's pretty crucial, huh?
Oh, it is, without a doubt. The healthcare in Paris is excellent, really high quality. But without insurance, those bills can add up really quickly, especially for things you might not even consider major. It's really about having that peace of mind, knowing you can access quality care if you need it without stressing about the financial side of things.
That makes a lot of sense. I actually have a friend who learned that lesson the hard way, sprained her ankle while traveling in Italy, no travel insurance,
Yeah.
and ended up with a medical bill that basically wiped out her entire travel savings. Ouch. Not the kind of souvenir you want.
Exactly. And one thing to keep in mind, too, France is part of what's called the Schengen area, and they have a specific requirement that you have at least 30,000 euro coverage for any medical emergencies. So when you're shopping around for insurance, make sure whatever plan you choose meets that minimum, because if it doesn't, you could run into problems getting into the country at all.
Noted. Okay. Good to know. Let's move on to something a little less intense. What about vaccinations? The guide mentions that beyond the routine ones we all should have, there's nothing specific required for France, which is a relief, but I know things can change, especially, in this post-COVID world.
That's true. March 2025 is considered well past the peak of COVID, but you're right, travel regulations, they can be a moving target. It's always smart to double-check what the current entry requirements are a little closer to your departure date, just to be on the safe side. Things change quickly sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, there was one more thing about vaccinations that I wanted to ask about, just because it caught my eye in the guide. It mentions flu season. Is that something I should be thinking about? I mean, is it something to be worried about?
It's definitely something to consider. If your trip falls during peak flu season, which is usually October to March, it might be worth getting a flu shot if you haven't already, especially if you're in any of those higher risk groups, like if you have a chronic illness or something. It's just an extra layer of protection.
Okay, good to know. One thing I was super happy to see in this guide was that the tap water in Paris is totally safe to drink. That means no more relying on expensive bottled water, which is good for the planet and my wallet. But I have to admit, I've heard that in some European cities, the water, even if it's safe, can taste, well, kind of weird. Is that the case in Paris?
No, you're in luck. The tap water in Paris is actually really high quality, meets all those strict EU standards and everything. You might notice a slight mineral taste, which is totally normal. It's nothing to be concerned about. And actually, here's a fun little Paris tip for you. Keep an eye out for those beautiful Wallace fountains. They're these ornate green fountains all over the city, and they provide free, clean drinking water.
Oh, wow. Free water fountains. That's awesome. I'll definitely be on the lookout for those. Okay, let's talk about emergencies. The guide highlights 112 as the number to know. Makes sense. It's the universal emergency number for the entire EU. But what about the language barrier? I mean, what if I can't explain what's happening in French? Will that be a problem?
Well, the good news is that those 112 operators, they often speak English. So you should be able to communicate what's going on. But even knowing a few basic phrases in French can help, like something as simple as "Où est l'hôpital?", which means "Where is the hospital?" Could be super helpful in a pinch.
Où est l'hôpital? Got it. Okay, I'm adding that to my list of phrases to learn. I was also thinking it wouldn't hurt to write down my hotel address and any allergies I have, just in case. Especially if I'm panicking and can't think straight.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Little preparations like that, they can make a huge difference when you're under pressure. So yeah, definitely do that.
Okay, one last question before we move on. I saw in the guide they mention packing medications with a doctor's note or something. Is that really necessary?
It's always a good practice, especially if you're carrying prescription medications. It can just avoid any misunderstandings or hassles at customs. They just want to make sure everything's legit. It's better to be safe than sorry.
Makes sense. And of course, the guide stresses comfy shoes for all the walking, which, it's Paris. Walking is kind of inevitable. Oh, absolutely. Comfortable shoes, those are non-negotiable for a city like Paris, which is best explored on foot. And actually, beyond the shoes, don't underestimate the value of pacing yourself. Paris has so much to offer, you could easily wear yourself out trying to see it all at once, especially if it's hot out.
Right, good point. And speaking of the weather, the guide also mentions dressing in layers, especially during those shoulder seasons, spring and fall. I guess Parisian weather can be a bit unpredictable, huh?
It can be. It can be a bit moody. Like one minute you're enjoying the sunshine and the next, bam, you're caught in a downpour. Having a light jacket or a travel umbrella can be a game changer.
Okay, so those are some great tips for navigating the city itself. Now let's talk about food. Paris is known for its incredible cuisine, but of course food safety is always on my mind when traveling. Is that something I should be particularly worried about in Paris?
Okay, so we were talking about food safety in Paris. I'm so excited to try all the incredible food, but, I also don't want to end up spending half my trip stuck in the hotel room.
Yeah, I hear ya. Food poisoning is definitely not on the itinerary. But honestly, you're in good hands in Paris. They have some seriously high standards for food safety, so you can generally feel pretty good about eating out. Whether it's a fancy restaurant or a little cafe, they're pretty strict about those things. But your guide does mention a couple of things to be a little extra cautious about.
Okay, good. I'm all about trying new things, but I also want to be smart about it?
Right, exactly. So one thing they highlight is being careful with anything raw, especially from those, street food vendors where you can't really see exactly how things are being prepared. It's always a good idea to make sure things are cooked through, especially if it's seafood or meat.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's probably good advice for traveling anywhere, not just Paris. Are there any, Paris-specific things I should be aware of?
Not so much specific foods. But the guide does mention something that's super important, and it's easy to forget when you're out and about, hand washing. Especially after, a day of sightseeing, you've been touching metro rails, museum exhibits, who knows what else.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to forget about those little things when you're caught up in all the excitement. And speaking of being out and about, comfy shoes are essential for Paris, right? The guide and pretty much everyone else says walking is the way to go.
You bet. Paris is definitely best explored on foot. And honestly, comfortable shoes are non-negotiable. But here's a tip that goes beyond just the shoes themselves. Don't underestimate pacing yourself. Paris has so much to see and do, and it's easy to get caught up trying to do everything at once. But trust me, you can totally wear yourself out if you're not careful, especially if it's hot out.
That is so true. I'm such a planner. I want to see everything. And sometimes I forget to factor in downtime, which is just as important. And, I did notice the guide mentions dressing in layers, especially during the spring and fall. Sounds like Parisian weather can be a bit unpredictable.
Oh, yeah. It can be. A little bit temperamental, let's say.
Yeah.
You could be basking in the sun one minute and then, bam, cotton downpour the next. So having a light jacket or a travel umbrella tucked in your bag can really save the day.
That's good advice. One thing I always think about when traveling, and especially when it comes to trying all these different foods, is allergies. I have a pretty bad nut allergy, and the guide recommends learning some key phrases in French to be able to communicate that. Do you think that's really necessary? I think in most places in Paris will have at least someone who speaks English, right?
Yeah, you'll definitely find English speakers, especially in the more touristy areas. But honestly, even if you can just manage a few basic phrases in French, it really shows respect. And it can actually make your interactions with the locals so much more enjoyable. Plus, when it comes to something like allergies, clear communication is so important. You don't want any misunderstandings there.
That's a good point. I always appreciate it when tourists make an effort to speak a little of the local language, even if it's just a few words. Okay, switching gears a bit. The guide talks about alcohol. And, I mean, come on, it's Paris. Wine is a big part of the culture, and I definitely plan on enjoying some. But the guide does remind us to be responsible, especially when we're out exploring the city.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in the excitement of being in a new place.
Hmm.
But remember, alcohol can lower your inhibitions, impair your judgment, make you a little more vulnerable, especially if you're in crowded areas.
Speaking of crowded areas, the guide does mention that even though Paris is considered really safe overall, pickpocketing is something to be aware of. Are there any specific areas or anything that I should be extra careful in?
The guide doesn't get into specifics about certain neighborhoods or anything, but they do point out those tourist hotspots.
Yeah.
And also crowded public transport, like
Oh.
the metro. Those are places where pickpockets tend to target people. But honestly, a little common sense goes a long way. Keep your valuables close. Don't be flashing a lot of cash or expensive jewelry. Just be aware of your surroundings.
Good advice. The guide also suggests making copies of important documents, like your passport and visa, and keeping them separate from the originals. Is that something you recommend?
Oh, definitely. I mean, if you were to lose your passport or visa, that would be a huge headache, right? But if you have copies tucked away somewhere safe, it can make getting replacements so much easier should you need them.
Okay, noted. This might seem like a random question, but is there anything I need to be aware of when it comes to like staying up to date on any local health alerts or anything while I'm in Paris?
It's never a bad idea to stay informed. Your guide recommends checking out resources like the French Ministry of Health website, especially if you're traveling during flu season or if there are any ongoing, health concerns or outbreaks. That way, you're in the loop.
Okay, I'll definitely add that to my list. One thing I really appreciated about this guide is that it doesn't just focus on the physical stuff, it also talks about mental well-being while traveling. I think that's so important and often overlooked.
I totally agree. Traveling can be amazing, but it can also be, tiring and sometimes even stressful. It's so important to listen to your body, take breaks when you need them, and don't be afraid to adjust your plans if things are feeling too hectic or overwhelming. It's your trip, you know.
I love that. It's so easy to get caught up in that feeling of like, I have to see and do everything. But sometimes the best moments happen when you just slow down and let things unfold naturally.
Exactly. That's where the magic is. Embrace the unexpected, be open to new experiences, and don't be afraid to, step outside of your comfort zone a little bit. That's what makes travel so special.
That's so true. Okay, before we wrap up this section, the guide has one last practical tip that I want to mention. It suggests packing a basic first aid kit.
Oh, yeah, that's a great one. I mean, pharmacies in Paris are pretty easy to find, but it's always good to have a few essentials with you, just in case. For those little mishaps that can happen when you're exploring a new city.
Yeah, for sure. Like what kind of things?
Well, think bandages, maybe some antibiotic cream for blisters, painkillers in case you get a headache, antiseptic wipes, those kinds of things. Oh, and if you're prone to motion sickness, some Dramamine is never a bad idea.
And maybe some allergy meds just in case, something unexpected happens.
Exactly. It's all about being prepared so you can relax and enjoy your trip without stressing about those little things.
All right. I feel like I'm getting a really good sense of what to expect, both in terms of like the practical side of things, but also just the mindset I need to have to really embrace the Parisian experience. Ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive. All right, we've covered so much ground on this deep dive into Paris health and safety. I feel like I'm leaving with a much clearer picture of what to expect, and how to prepare.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, it's all about empowering yourself with knowledge so you can actually relax and enjoy your trip.
Exactly. So before we wrap up, let's do a quick recap of those key takeaways, just to make sure it's all fresh in our minds. We started by talking about hospitals and that whole two-tiered system that France has.
Right. So while Paris definitely has a fantastic healthcare system overall, as someone traveling from outside the EU, it's important to be aware of the cost differences between public and private healthcare. And having good travel insurance, it really can't be overstated.
For sure, that 30,000 euro minimum coverage for the Schengen area, that's something everyone should make sure they have. Then we moved on to some of those everyday health and safety things, like food and water.
Yeah, and in general, Paris has really high standards when it comes to those things. But we talked about being a little extra cautious with raw foods, especially
Hmm.
from, places where you can't really see how things are being handled.
Mm.
And of course, hand washing, always important. But then there's also the joy of those free Wallace fountains. They're a great way to stay hydrated and save some money.
I'm so excited about those fountains. They're already on my list of things to see. We also talked about those little things that can make a big difference, in terms of comfort and peace of mind.
Like packing comfy shoes. That's a must. And dressing in layers. Paris weather can be unpredictable, so you got to be prepared for anything. And of course, having a little first aid kit can be a lifesaver, for those little bumps and bruises that happen when you're traveling.
And those key French phrases, even if you can just manage a few, it can really go a long way.
For sure. It shows you care, and it can make your interactions with the locals so much more enjoyable.
One of the things I really liked about this whole deep dive is that it wasn't just about the practical stuff. We also touched on the mental and emotional side of travel, which is so important.
Absolutely. Remember to pace yourself, listen to your body, and don't be afraid to take breaks or, adjust your plans if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's your trip. It should be enjoyable, not a race to see everything.
Exactly. Embrace the unexpected, be open to new experiences. Sometimes the best memories come from those unplanned moments.
So true. Well, I think we've covered just about everything. Any final words of wisdom for our listener as they get ready for their Parisian adventure?
Just relax, soak it all in, and
Sure.
try not to stress about the little things. Paris is a magical city. There's so much to discover.
I can't wait. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Paris health and safety. We hope you found it helpful and that you feel confident and ready to make the most of your trip. And as always, if any other questions come up, as you're planning, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help. Au revoir.